So, today we are going to talk about Samr, and with me is my husband Mike. He is a ninth grade English teacher. Um, so, first I'll ask Mike, have you ever heard of Samr before?
Not before today, no.
All right, so it will be brand new information. First, I want to point out or explain why I put the pictures up here that I did. So, the Vitruvian Man, is that something that's familiar to you, Mike?
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, yes. So, but it's all made into a matrix technology looking setup. The reason I put this here is because the Vitruvian Man calls to mind the interdisciplinary nature of Leonardo da Vinci's genius. He was able to draw and pull together all of these different disciplines in order to make new knowledge. So, that to me is very similar to what the point of Samr might be, but we will come back to that. So here we are defining Samr. The Samr model was put together by Dr. Ruben R. Puentedura, and basically what we have here is the setup. We have substitution, augmentation, and that would be in the enhancement section, and modification and redefinition, which is down in transformation. So I'm going to give you a second to look at this, Mike, and then I'm going to ask you a question about it. So looking at this, what is your first initial thought?
Well, I think it's interesting that they break it into four categories and break those two categories into just how deep does the change go.
Yes, and that's a great observation. That is kind of the point of this, right? So, obviously, substitution is just what it sounds. Technology acts as a direct substitute, no functional change. So, that doesn't sound very deep. It sounds very surface level. Then we have augmentation. Technology acts as a direct substitute with functional improvement. So, something about the technology makes the assignment more technologically engaging. These both enhance an assignment that you might have done in person or on paper. Next, we have modification. Technology allows for a significant task redesign. So, where you once did one thing in person, you now do something else. And lastly, there's redefinition, which is technology allows for the creation of new tasks previously inconceivable. So, I'm going to ask again, now that I've shared this with you in the way I have arranged this, do you perhaps see a connection between Samr and the Vitruvian Man?
I would say so, yes.
Right. So I'm fishing for redefinition is like Da Vinci's approach to things, the new ideas. However, there are some issues with this model, and we will talk about them shortly. So, before I move on, Mike, do you have any questions about what this means or what it is doing?
I don't think so.
Great. So here I have a bunch of examples. I feel like examples are key. I do not understand things usually unless I have at least a couple examples. So, in the English classroom, whether it be at the middle school level, where I was previously, or at the high school level, where Mike is now, research in preparation for some kind of document creation is a very, very, very common task. What we have here is a breakdown of the different parts that might be involved in that project and how they might look at the different Samr model levels. So I'm going to give you a second to look at this, Mike.
Okay.
Right, so let's first look at substitution. Substitution here has a very distinct feel to it. Substitution feels as though, well, what do you think? What do you think, Mike? What might this tone be here?
Well, since the task and the information and content hasn't really changed in any way, I think it's, you know, it's a very, slight measure to take.
Right. It doesn't seem important. This seems like it's not good. It's not good enough. And then you look down here at redefinition, right? And you see very interactive ideas that require what might these things require of the students before they could even attempt to create this project. I'll give you a second to think about it. What do you think, Mike?
I would say they need to rethink what it is that the teacher will actually be seeing in their finished product and their work versus
Yes.
what they usually end up producing.
Sure, absolutely. So it would be very different than what they're used to. They might also need to know how to use all of these different tools, right? Not every kid has iTunes. Not every kid knows how to work a collaborative audio notebook. So that would take time within the classroom, at least in my opinion, right? Yeah. So this is how I felt the first time that I heard about Samr. I felt like this gal. A little overwhelmed, like it was a little bit too much pressure here. We were already trying to figure out how to make sure that the kids were on what they were supposed to be on and doing what they were supposed to be doing and learning something from it. And then you want me to redefine everything? That felt a little unfair. So I would say, and that was years ago, that was about 5 years ago. Currently, the situation is a lot more intense in the K-12 segment. So, if I were to ask you, Mike, to make sure that all of your lessons hit redefinition, how might you feel about that?
Initially very intimidated, a little overwhelmed.
Right. It's kind of unfair. Not everything can be redefinition. And that is where we are going. So, looking at this again, what I have gleaned from looking at multiple resources, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment, is that one level is not necessarily more important than the other. For example, with the class tasks here, I would say that all of those things are just as important as the others. If you don't have notes, you can't present your research. If you don't present your research, your notes are meaningless. So it's all interconnected, as is the Samr model levels. But we will expand on that. Blend Space. So when I was looking for information to help me do this, I found Blend Space. And on Blend Space, there was a board, I guess you could call it, that had a bunch of images for Samr. And one of them was this. And as you know, Mike, I really like coffee. So this one called out to me. And you see it explained in an analogy. I always understand things better with an analogy. So here we have substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition as it would apply to coffee. Now, again, looking at those, in my opinion, one's not really better than the other. Sometimes you want a cup of coffee. That's all you want. Sometimes you want all of it. You want the nutmeg, you want the cinnamon, you want the pumpkin spice. You want the whipped cream, you want it all. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't have time for that. Sometimes that's too much. So, at this point, if I were doing a professional development with a group, I won't make you do this, Mike, because you do not have someone to discuss with. But if I were doing this with a group, I would have them at this time try to first have some thinking time to think up their own analogy. And then second, share that analogy with a partner, perhaps in a breakout room if we were using Zoom or some other sort of direct message back and forth in a virtual setting. After that, I would ask one pair or one person of each pair to share. So instead of doing that to you, Mike, I'll see if you have any questions at this time.
Well, I'm not much of a coffee person, so For me, I would say no. I think this does make sense. It seems to be a matter of starting with a base and then adding to it and getting more and more, you know, elaborate and distant from the that starting point. No,
Yeah,
I think this makes sense to me.
great, great. So, as I was looking around, I also found this lady's blog. And as you see here, I included her bio. She wrote an article that I found was really helpful to describe the Samr model. So, here we go. She says, and her title I really like, A Perspective on the Samr Model. Again, the idea that Samr is not something that should be prescribed, just like anything in education. You can't go all in 100% without considering the interrelationships of things. So, anyways, just a perspective on the Samr model. But as you see in her heading there, it says, erase the line and swim laps. When I first heard about Samr, I was very overwhelmed, like I had said. Then, a few years later, we had another professional development meeting where we talked about Samr, and it cleared it up and actually made me feel so much better, because what that presenter said is basically what Jacqueline B. Stevens is saying. There is no line. I mean, there might be. You could think of it that way if it helps. But you're swimming laps. In a real school year, you are swimming laps constantly. And that's how it's supposed to be. If you don't ever go out of the deep end, you're not getting the full experience of swimming. Just like if you never leave the shallow end. So I would recommend this to anybody who is interested in learning more about Samr from that perspective. Now, we'll go back here. So, this article here is very recent. You see, it's May 4th, 2020, well after COVID stormed through education violently and ended everybody up on the virtual lessons. So, you see, again, that it says, good technology integration isn't about using fancy tools. It's about being aware of the range of options and picking the right strategy or strategies for the lesson at hand. Now, I would say that if I were still teaching, this is great. But it seems a little unfair during this situation. Is it just one more thing that we have to do? Well, maybe. What I would say is more likely is that you are already doing a lot of these things as an online teacher. You've been thrust online and you are creatively using your resources to figure out how to make it quality instruction. The point of learning more about Samr at that point is not to change what you're doing or to say that what you're doing isn't any good. It is to say that there are ways to look at assignments that are different than you have before. So you have to ask what you're looking for. I like this one a lot because you see that at each level, the little swimmer is doing something different. Their purpose is likely different. For example, sometimes you want to ride in a boat. Sometimes you want to be in a submarine. So that is why I like this one so much. This is another one that I found really helpful. This is the one that I saw when I felt that I finally understood Samr. So again, erase the line, we're all swimming laps. Here are a few more articles that might be helpful if you are interested in learning more about Samr. So, Mike, I say thank you for being a willing participant.
Thank you for informing me about Samr.